Women also performed very arduous outdoor work in relation to housewifery, shouldering windfall branches home from the woods on these wooden frames or in big bin bags so that you could just barely see their legs coming down the road. Or trying to carry 5 or 6 gallons of water from a well that perhaps might be a half-mile away from the house. Those who were too sickly or too grand to go down to the flakes or into the fields or into the woods were objects of pity or scorn. Only local middle-class women, a very small, predominantly English group, followed the pattern of withdrawing into domesticity during this period. Far from being economically dependent, these women were actively engaged in a variety of economic activities, not just household production, but paid work as domestic and fishing servants, as washerwomen and seamstresses for single fishermen and middle-class clients. They were in the hospitality trade and in community healing. Surviving merchant account books demonstrate a robust participation of women in the economic lives of their communities, running independent economic activities and having separate accounts with their merchant, regardless of their marital status, which is unusual. And because Newfoundland's economy operated on a truck or credit system, these women were therefore a significant part of the exchange economy that underwrote the entire fishery. I'm just going to show you a couple of examples of accounts. They're not in the original because they'd be too hard to read, so I've typed them up for you. This is an 1840 account from Mary Foley with the merchant firm Goodrich's in Renews. And you can see from the debit side, the left-hand side, that she's received supplies from the merchant on her own account. And on the credit side, which is the right-hand side, we can see that she has partially paid for her supplies by providing eggs, ducks, and cream to the merchant house. She's also been washing, if you see the lower part there, she's been washing and sewing for fishermen in the community. You see Philip Power, John Sheen, William Rowe, and John Beer's names there. And this too has been credited to her account. Now what's happened is that a contra entry has been made in the merchant's books by debiting the accounts of these male customers. So her washing and sewing will show up on the debit side of their account, and then they will ultimately bring in cash or kind, or more likely fish and oil, at the end of the season to pay. And that's how the system worked. Here's another one. This is Julia McCarthy, also with Goodrich's. And we can see there on the right-hand side in her credit account that she was sewing and washing for the Goodrich family itself, also for fishermen in the Renews area. She worked as shore crew on Goodrich's flakes. Down on the bottom there, you can see 13 and a half days' work on the flakes. And she sold hay to the firm. And there are numerous similar examples. All these women made important contributions to family incomes through cash or earning extra credit. Some even had their profits applied towards their husbands' accounts. Most remained in debt to the merchant, but this was true of most men as well. And this was a chronic symptom of the truck system. And the fact that merchants carried their debts over from one year to the next indicates that they had some reasonable expectation that they were going to get something out of this down the road, that they would be paid. So the working careers of Irish women within the fishing community were quite multifaceted, and their fishing work, while crucial, was just part of a package of economic coping skills that helped make family ends meet. Women's contributions to family economies had repercussions, and not just within their families, but in the broader and social economic life of their communities. And I find that there they really enjoyed considerable status, power, and decision-making autonomy. They were household managers responsible for looking after any small amounts of cash the family might have earned and stretching resources to get their families through that long and hungry month of March before the merchants had advanced spring diets on credit. In marriages, they were seen as partners rather than helpmates, and men and women discussed concerns and made major decisions together. Although a veneer of patriarchal authority was maintained in public, men had usually consulted with their wives before airing their opinions on community matters or before settling up with the merchants in the fall. As a local saying goes, she made the cannonballs and he fired them. And please note that this influence had nothing to do with male absence, as often the explanation offered in other fishing areas, because these were inshore fishing communities. So the men returned from the water every day, Okay, so that doesn't help us explain this. There were other spheres in which these women exercised informal power, and I can't go into them because I'm conscious of my time constraints, but there are two that I'm just going to very briefly mention here, and maybe we can talk about them later. Firstly, there was the spiritual realm, where Irish Newfoundland women acted as both spiritual guides and symbolic figures in both formal Catholicism and also an informal pre-Christian system of beliefs and practices. Secondly, there was a very public sphere of conflict resolution, be it through verbal and verbal wrangling and physical assault, or individual assaults, collective actions, but we certainly see them very, very out there. Also in the court system, another place that we see them, as complainants and defendants in a wide range of actions, from debt collection and employment disputes to matrimonial matters and criminal charges. And we really must resist the urge when we do women's history to sort of summons up the image of woman as the helpless victim in all these court cases, because this would not even closely resemble the complexity of their involvement. For example, women in assault cases in court were aggressors almost as often as they were victims, by a proportion of 86 to 100 in my study area. And when they were assailants, they were just as likely to pick on the men as the women. So it's quite evident that the assertiveness of these women was not at all shocking to the local community, and that they felt that they had the right to protect the interests of themselves or their families or the communal interests in the public sphere. And it's also very interesting to note the very sort of matter-of-fact way that local magistrates dealt with these women in the courtroom. And I don't want to belittle the systemic discrimination that women encounter through the formal legal system, but it's always really important to monitor how statutory law and common law plays out on the ground. Local magistrates on the Southern Avalon gave women access to formal legal processes, even waiving coverture on occasion. They meted out similar judgments and sentences to both men and women. They did not in any way encourage abused women to go back to failed marriages. They recognized separations on the ground. They upheld women's rights to fair and decent treatment within employment contracts. Certainly, although they increasingly monitored the behavior of women in their own class, in the middle class, they did not try to encourage these fishing women to adopt any sort of modified form of respectability, or plebeian respectability. They certainly didn't try to encourage them towards domesticity and economic dependence. And that's quite different from what we see in many other British jurisdictions. But these men, these merchants, were predominantly from mercantile families, okay? And that they made their money by supplying local fishing families in return for their fish and oil. And the resident fishery had become overwhelmingly dependent upon the household production unit, in which the labor of these fisherwomen, work that took place in public, on stages, on flakes, was essential and accepted. And as noted, these women in their various economic capacities were also very much part of the exchange economy. So it was therefore not in the interests of these magistrates cum merchants to encourage the withdrawal of these fish-producing women into the respectability of the private sphere.